Hi. Hi, everybody. How about a big hand for Scott Dubé and the crew for cleaning the whole parking lot? Isn't that good? Great job. Wow. So let's open our Bibles to 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Lord, thank you um, for the being able to gather together here on this snowy day in Baltimore. Pray that you would cover and protect all of your people on the roads, Lord, in the next couple of days, and maybe even some ice coming on Sunday. So especially watch over each and every one, keep everyone safe behind the wheel of their car. Bless these thoughts. Thank you for those that have courageously stepped into the elements to be here today. And just speak to our hearts. We ask you to do that in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So, 2 Corinthians, the first chapter, Paul he's talking about his own challenges, his own difficulties. It's kind of interesting because he uses 10 different Greek words. Well, the Bible uses 10 different Greek words to describe suffering in the New Testament. And Paul uses 5 of those words in this epistle alone. So there was a great deal of suffering that was happening in his life as well as the lives of others as well. But the most frequently used word for suffering in this epistle is the Greek word thlipsis, spelled Thlipis, thlipsis. And it means to be put in a narrow way, to be confined, to be under great pressure. I remember reading in the book of Revelations in one of the 7 churches that were under tremendous persecution. It spoke about the fact that they were experiencing persecution, poverty, and pressure. And it was the Greek word thlipsis again. And the word picture was that the believer was placed on the ground, and this board was placed over his chest, and then these great heavy rocks were placed upon their chest, creating this intense and overwhelming pressure. Paul used the same word to describe what he was going through and said that he was pressed out of measure. And listen to this part, even despairing of his own life. Imagine that. Pressed out of measure, despairing of his own life. So he's talking about pressure, affliction, tribulation, trouble. And he uses these words throughout this epistle, and especially here in the first chapter, rather extensively. And he felt hemmed in by difficult circumstances. Probably all of us can identify with him. We've all, at some point in our lives, and if you haven't, you will, hemmed in by difficult circumstances, sensing the pressure of those difficult circumstances. And really, when that happens, and I think the Old Testament word, the Hebrew word for distress, was to be pressed in on every side with no way out, but always a way up. And that's what God allows to happen in our lives. pressed in that narrow way, experiencing that pressure, that affliction, and there is no way out. You can't even find a door to be released from it, but there is always a way up. It's God's way of saying, I've ordained these pressures, these afflictions, these tribulations, so that you will learn to trust me above everything else. And you know, you could say that some suffering is simply the result of the fact that we're human and we're subject to pain. That's a fact. Other sufferings come because we're God's people, and we have chosen to serve him. And suffering sometimes is the result of that. But that's like our choice, isn't it? Sounds a lot like Moses, right? He looks at the pleasures of sin, which are for a season, and what does he do? He chooses rather to suffer affliction with the children of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. We've done that. We've made that decision too. And I love how truthful the scriptures are, because you might even hear preachers say, don't, stay away from sin. It's horrible, it's dangerous, it won't fulfill you, it won't give you any pleasure. And God says, no, it will. It's pleasurable for a season. Right? For a season. How quickly do these seasons come and go? Very quickly. I mean, today they're shoveling, the snow off the parking lot and the sidewalks. Tomorrow, or a few tomorrows from now, we'll be wiping the sweat from our brow. And we will be saying, oh, these intense summers of Baltimore. Right? It's incredible how quickly the seasons come and go. And so we should always look at our trouble not as an accident. Not as an accident, as we sometimes have a tendency to do. But really, as believers, everything about our lives is divinely appointed. And I emphasize that word, everything. I read an interesting story about a coach. It's actually Bill Belichick, who's the coach of the New England Patriots. His father was a coach. And he was a coach, I believe it was at the Naval Academy. And he was such a brilliant coach, and I suppose we're not surprised now when we know that as to why his son, Bill Belichick, has been such a successful coach. He was such a successful coach that his team played the Army in the traditional Army-Navy game at the end of the season. And they won the game 14-0. But he was so meticulous and so well prepared that the opposing coach said to his team afterwards, he says, do you know when this game was won? The game was not just won out there on the field of play, an hour ago. It was won 2 weeks ago because their coach was so well prepared and so well prepared his team that game was won 2 weeks ago because of how great a coach he was. Well, listen, whatever happens in your life, that has not been prepared by God 2 weeks ago. That has been prepared by God from eternity past. You talk about a game plan, God's got a good one. And we are central in that game plan. And we are important in it. So again, everything about our lives, divinely appointed. Please remember that. The next time you feel the intense pressure of life and what's happening to you, remember that. So when we're in these trials of life, and by the way, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12, what does Peter say when we experience these fiery trials? He basically said, to use contemporary language, don't freak out. Don't lose it. Don't be overwhelmed. Don't panic. Don't question yourself or God and say, why is this? What's going on? The trial of your faith is essential. It is absolutely essential. So, if there's really only three options when you think about the tests of life. One of them is that our problems are the result of fate or chance. And if that's the case, then the best choice that we have is just give up. The other option is that if the responsibility to control all of this is up to us, that's equally as hopeless. But the third option, the only option, if God is in control, then he's going to give us a provision to triumph over those troubles. And that's the option that we choose in life, that God is in control. Do we believe that? And can we trust him even when things seem so out of control in our lives? We know this about the trial of the test of our faith in 1 Corinthians 10:13. We know that God permits it. He permits it. He allows it, right? It's common to all believers. I've never met a believer that's walking by faith, that in their hearts, their desire is to be a disciple. I've never met a believer that has not had their faith tested or tried. You know, imagine coming across a believer and you're talking about the trials of your faith, and they kind of look at you like, what are you talking about? What do you mean? What is that? My life has just been bliss, perfect bliss, ever since I asked Christ. I mean, I had all kinds of problems before I got saved, but now it's just, life is a bowl of cherries. Yeah, that's right. Anybody that thinks life is a bowl of cherries is bananas, to use the fruit analogy. So God permits it, right? And what I love about it is that he's never going to allow you to be tested above that which you are able, but will, with the test, provide a way of escape. He provides the way of escape so that you can bear up under it. Why? Because he's faithful. That's what we read in 1 Corinthians 10:13. He is faithful. So don't panic. Don't be bewildered by it. That's what Peter says. Paul says, I'm sure that the sufferings of this present world are not even worthy to be compared with the glory that will be revealed in us, both now and in the future. There is present glory and there is future glory. And that's why we have such hope, because God is at work. God's doing this. So don't panic. He permits it. And then look at verse 8 here, 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Paul says, I don't want to have you uninformed, brethren, of our trouble, which came to us in Asia, how we were pressed out of measure. Notice this word, above strength. Okay? And insomuch that we even thought we were going to die. Ever been there? You think this is it? There's no escape from this one. This is the one that will do me in. But what is he saying here in verse 8? In one simple phrase, God's got this. That's what he's saying. God's saying, I got this. There's no need for you to panic. There's no need for you to come apart at the seams of your soul. I've got this. Even a trial so great that the Apostle Paul thought it was going to take him out. Right? But what do we know about God? When he puts his children in the furnace, he always keeps his eye on the thermostat and his hand on the thermometer. Right? Always. And, like the three Hebrew boys, did God Did God close the door to that furnace and say, I am not going to allow you to go into that furnace? No, he did not. And this is how God sometimes works. Oftentimes, he will deliver us from the trial or the trouble, and then sometimes he chooses to deliver us in it. But he always delivers. That's what we need to remember. And remember this: it doesn't matter how many previous victories that you have had in the past. It doesn't matter how experienced you are. You would think someone like the Apostle Paul wouldn't even need to write these words, the great apostle, after all that he had been through. He wouldn't even have to write these things, but he wrote them. In other words, even Paul, in his present predicament that he describes here in the first chapter of 2 Corinthians, was saying, with all that I had previously gone through, I was hopeless. Pressed out of measure. No strength, absolutely none. Why does God allow this to happen? Because he's got to show us, he's got to remind us of how weak we really are. And he does that. Again, someone like the Apostle Paul, with all of his experience, so greatly trained, many trials previously up to this point, still, God never wants us to trust in ourselves. He's always teaching us to trust him. And it will always be in our what? Our weakness. It will always be in our weakness. That's where we find God's strength. It's kind of like Abraham and Sarah. The promise, you will have a child. I will bless the world through this child. They wait for the child, no child. They keep waiting, no child. They keep. So, I mean, you know they're thinking, well, we're going to reach an age where it's going to be impossible. And that's when God says, that's what I'm waiting for. I'm waiting for it to be impossible for you to fulfill a promise that I have made. I don't even need your cooperation. I just need you to trust me. And when it was impossible, God, through resurrection power, made it possible and produced that child. That's just like God. And then look at verse 9. Paul even said this: we had the sentence of death in ourselves. Why? So that we would not trust in ourselves, but rather in God, who can raise from the dead. Remember the story of Abram taking his son, Isaac, and saying to his servants at the bottom of that hill, the child and I will be back. Knowing full well that God said, bring him to the top of the mountain and take his life. But he said, we'll be back. Both of us will be back. Do you know what he believed? Prior to any New Testament teaching on the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead, he believed that God could raise him from the dead. So Paul says in verse 10, and I love verse 10, who delivered us from so great a death and will deliver us, or doth deliver us, which means now, in whom we trust that he will yet deliver us. He is covering past, present, and future. That's beautiful. It's like he looks back, he says, God delivered. He looks around, he says, God will deliver. And he looks ahead, and he says, God will deliver. It doesn't matter what the circumstances are. He has confidence in the fact that God will deliver because he always has, he presently does, and he believes that he will. Past, present, and future. And again, it may be that we're delivered from them. How many trials do you suppose God has delivered us from? We don't even know. But then he chooses to what? Deliver us in some of those trials. And we cannot necessarily look at other people's lives as a pattern as to how God will deliver in our lives. We want to. We want to look at someone else's experience and say, well, and we listen to their testimony. They say, this is how God delivered. And we might sit there and say, well, then that is how he will deliver in my life. He may not. He may choose to do something completely. We cannot take God and put him in our theological box. He will not be confined to it. He does it all. He does it all to draw us to himself. And that is so important that we recognize everything that he allows to draw us to himself. That's the goal. So, does he hear your cry for help? Psalm 34, verse 6 says, this poor man cried, the Lord heard him and saved him out of all of his troubles. That's a great promise to carry with us in our souls, all of our troubles. So God, he will enable us to deal with our troubles. He will deliver us from our troubles, and he will be glorified through our troubles and our trials. The highest service you and I can render before God is to bring him glory. And I love the fact that as Paul was describing everything that happened here, he also employed the prayers of the saints. Listen to what he says. Verse 11, you also helping together by prayer for us, that by the gift bestowed upon us and by the means of many people, thanks may be given by many on your behalf. Many were... I love that about the apostle. He was never ashamed to employ the prayers of other believers.